Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. Let's talk about Kathleen Kennedy's next LucasFilm movie that opens today across the US, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, which I now prefer to call Indiana Jones and the Dildo of Destruction. The last video that I had released about this movie was back on June 9th, which wasn't long after the lackluster premiere for the movie at the Cannes Film Festival in France back on May 18th, with Lucasfilm President Kathleen Kennedy and Disney CEO Bob Iger in attendance. That was also the same day that Disney announced the closure of its failed and overpriced Star Wars Galactic Star Cruiser Hotel at Disney World, right when Kathleen Kennedy was too preoccupied with the events at Cannes. This fifth Indiana Jones movie, which no fans of the franchise actually wanted in the first place because no one was asking for it, will be the first movie to be released by Lucasfilm since Jar Jar Abrams' dumpster fire of a movie, Star Wars IX: The Rise of Palpatine, was released in 2019, which was 3.5 years ago. And this movie, Indiana Jones and the Dildo of Destruction, is very likely not going to break even thanks to the massive $294.7 million production budget that was spent by Disney and Lucasfilm, as well as the current very low predictions for the movie's opening weekend box office. Now, since no marketing budget numbers have been reported for the movie, I have to estimate the movie's break-even point by creating a possible range of values that takes into account the 50% of gross ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, as well as the additional costs of marketing the movie and other miscellaneous costs that the studio pays above and beyond the production budget. So to estimate a break-even point range, I will multiply the movie's bloated $294.7 million production budget by 2.5 for the mid-range estimate, and 3.0 for an upper range estimate to yield a possible range of $736.8 million to $884.1 million. And this is why many are reporting that the movie may need around $900 million to break even. What's also interesting is that the previous Indiana Jones movie, which no one wanted either, the infamous Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, actually earned $786.6 million at the global box office, but it only had a $185 million production budget, so its break-even point was around $462.5 million to $555 million, meaning that it made a small profit. So this movie, Indiana Jones and the Dildo of Destruction, has to earn at least around that much just to break even. But how much will it need to earn during its opening weekend to help reach that point? First, let's examine the history of the previous 4 movies in the franchise. Since the first 3 movies came out in 1981, 84, and 89, the total number of available movie theaters in the US was considerably smaller than it is today, which will skew the ability to determine an average weekly drop for those films. Consequently, I normalized the timeframes for those early movies by taking the number of movie theaters between then and now into account to reflect what they might have been had there been the same number of movie theaters back then. By doing that, the normalized average weekly drops for the earliest movies are in line with today's typical average weekly drops, and the overall normalized average weekly drop for the entire franchise comes out to 33.87%, with a standard deviation of 2.07%. So the range of average weekly drops that I will use to project how well the movie may perform are based on the normalized overall average, 1 standard deviation above and below that, and 2 standard deviations above it in the event that the movie underperforms even worse. This gives me a range of average weekly drops of 31.8%, 33.87%, 35.93%, and 38%. The domestic shares for the 4 previous movies don't have the same skewing issues as the average weekly drops. The overall average domestic share for the 4 previous Indiana Jones movies is 49.33%, with a standard deviation of 10.16%, which aren't unreasonable values. So in order to reach a range of $736.8 million to $884.1 million in global box office revenues so that the movie can potentially break even, we can estimate a potential range of final domestic box office revenue required based on a range of domestic shares ranging from 39.17%, 49.33%, and 59.48%. Which are the overall average domestic share for the previous films and one standard deviation above and below it. For the best case domestic share of around 39.17%, the final domestic box office needed to break even would range from $289 million to $346 million. At the mid-range domestic share of around 49.33%, the domestic box office would need to range from $363 million to $436 million. And at the worst case highest domestic share of 59.48%, the domestic box office would need to range from $438 million to $525 million. There's no overlap between these three ranges because of how high the standard deviation is for the domestic share. But what would the domestic opening weekend box office need to be to reach these levels? In the best case 39.17% domestic share with average weekly drops ranging from 31.8%, 33.87%, 35.93%, and 38%, the domestic opening weekend box office would need to range anywhere from a low of $92 million to a high of $132 million. But at the mid-range domestic share of 49.33% and the same range of average weekly drops in box office, the range of opening weekend domestic box office increases to $116 million to $166 million. And finally, at the upper range domestic share of 59.48%, the range of required domestic opening weekend box office revenue goes up again to a low of $139 million to a high of $200 million, which is the worst case for the movie to be able to break even. But that minimum domestic opening weekend box office of $92 million for the best case domestic share and average weekly drops is still well above what the media is now predicting the movie will make during its opening weekend. As of Tuesday, Deadline is predicting that the domestic opening weekend box office for Indiana Jones and the Dildo of Destruction will only be around $60 million to $65 million, and that the global opening weekend box office will be around $140 million. Thus, Deadline is predicting a domestic share ranging from 42.86% to 46.43%. Both of which are less than one standard deviation away from the overall average domestic share of 49.33%. But since in either case, the same $140 million global opening weekend box office would occur, the projected final global box office for Indiana Jones and the Dildo of Destruction, using the same range of possible average weekly drops as I had just used, will be from $368 million to $440 million. With the estimated break-even point range of $736.8 million to $884.1 million, this means that the movie is set to lose around $296.8 million to $516.1 million in global gross box office revenue. For Disney and Lucasfilm, we'll divide that range by 2 to see a potential loss for the studio of anywhere from $148.2 million to $258 million. And that, my friends, means that if the movie does end up losing as much as $258 million, Indiana Jones and the Dildo of Destruction could end up being a bigger flop than The Flash, which is currently looking to lose around $57.5 million to $183 million. As I had shared in the video that I had entitled, Who Will Be the Biggest Flop Part 2, which I released a few days ago. So we'll just have to wait and see how much money Indiana Jones and the Dildo of Destruction will lose in the coming weeks. But it will definitely be a new contestant in Who Will Be the Biggest Flop. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and please feel free to share a comment. If you'd like to see more of our videos in the future and help support this channel, please press the red subscribe button, and please press the bell to receive notifications for new content. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.